Venkat, Raman, Himanshu, seniors, fellow members, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening and a warm welcome to you all. Before I introduce this very important subject and the learned speaker, I would like to make a comment. You must have read the sweeping comments made by the ITAT against chartered accountants in the case of Vijay Meghani versus Deputy CIT. With respect, the Honorable Tribunal seems to have been unduly harsh. This case appears to be an aberration and cannot apply universally to entire CA profession. Such aberration possibly occurs in different spheres of the society, and the same must be dealt with appropriately. It is possible that the concerned CA did not understand the import of his actions when he tendered the affidavit. It is equally possible that the deep anguish expressed by the Honorable Tribunal members is on account of some past experience. At the same time, we professionals should treat the concern of the Tribunal as a warning bell. We should not only carry out our duties with extreme care, but also ensure that the society at large perceives us to be competent and diligent. The Bombay Chartered Accountant Society continues to serve the CA profession and the society at large through various educational programs and other related activities. And I see large number of chartered accountants, even though there are no CPE hour benefits, continue to patronize our programs. The BCS is committed to pursuing excellence and in the profession and upholding values, and will continue to strive for them. I believe that Institute will also respond and take actions to ensure that the ITAT's concerns are effectively addressed. Now I come to the subject of the evening. After a prolonged legislative process lasting over several years, the Companies Act 2013 has been has overhauled the corporate law and has elaborate provisions impacting the accounting and auditing aspects. There are several provisions pertaining to internal financial control, or IFC for short, that we must be concerned about. Section 134(5)(e) requires that in case of a listed company, the director's responsibility statement should, amongst other matters, state that directors have laid down the internal financial controls to be followed by the company, and that such controls are adequate and operating effectively. This clause also defines the term internal financial controls to mean the policies and procedures adopted by the company for ensuring the orderly and efficient conduct of its business, including adherence to company's policy, safeguarding of its assets, prevention and detection of frauds and errors, the accuracy and completeness of the accounting records, and timely preparation of reliable information. Section 143(3)(1) requires the auditor's report to also state whether the company has adequate internal financial control system in place and the operating effectiveness of such controls. In fact, very interestingly, a question does arise because 134(5)(e), a director's responsibility statement, is applicable only to listed companies, whereas 143(3)(1) does not specifically apply to listed companies, but possibly applies to all companies. Now, how do we read these two sections together? Would it be fair to infer that even auditors are required to comment only when the responsibility is made applicable only to listed companies? So auditors' report should also be applicable only to the listed companies. Maybe we look forward to the learned faculty for this answer. Over and above that, there are provisions pertaining to audit committees where they are also required to ensure this internal financial deal with internal financial control, and also the independent directors under Schedule 4 are bestowed with the responsibility, a similar responsibility. So while we look at that, there are we need to understand these provisions in detail and also examine the implications. The questions that come to my mind are how the IFC framework can be effectively established and implemented. What is the international experience? What are the best practices? What are the nuances in Indian context? What kind of documents are we required to maintain to establish that IFC was indeed operating effectively? And I think to that, these various questions, we will have answers from our learned faculty for the day. V. Venkatramanan, if I pronounce correctly. May I call you as Venkat to make it simple? He is a partner with Bharat S. Raut and Company, and he's been a member of the firm's financial services practice since 1999. He's worked on audit, due diligence, securities offering assignments in India and also overseas. So he has a very vast international experience as well. He was part of the team that established the firm's accounting advisory services practice in India and has been the engagement partner on IFRS conversion and other engagements for a number of companies, not only in India, but the entire South Asian region. He's also the financial services sector leader for the risk consulting practice, where they are responsible for accounting advisory, financial risk management, governance, risk and compliance, and forensic services practice. I think Venkat opens his inning with BCS at this platform, and I'm sure he'll be very strong and a long player with the society. Before I invite him to address us, I request Raman to honor him with a token as a token of our gratitude and appreciation. Venkat, floor is all yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I must say that I have actually participated in BCS programs in the past, and one of the traditions that I really appreciate is that you give the memento before the speaker speaks. So, it puts a little less pressure actually. When I was invited to speak about this topic, one of the things that occurred to me is that why would a set of people really be interested in listening to such a boring subject in the evening, which could be potentially very theoretical, because at one level everyone seems to know what internal controls means, and at the same time it seems to be a relatively big issue. So one of the things that I'm going to seek to avoid doing is make this discussion, and this should be a discussion, very theoretical or very textbookish in terms of approach. What I'll do instead is try and give you maybe just walking through a few areas. We'll talk a bit about definitions. I think Nitin has already done the job of explaining to you what Clause 49 says and what the Companies Act says. But then I'd like to spend a little or the most amount of time talking about some of the international experience around internal control related reporting, and finally just share with you what I see as the real practical day-to-day roadblocks that we are going to face. I'd also be happy to take questions anytime through, so if you feel that something is not being clear, it's a small enough group, please feel free to stop me. I'll be more than happy to clarify, and also take questions at the end if you have any. So let's get started. Last week I was on holiday and I spent some time actually thinking about definitions. Honestly, normally we don't spend that much time. And firstly, I could not find a comprehensive definition of internal financial controls, let me be honest. But what I did find is many definitions of internal controls. And I've listed out 3 over here from different public sources. As you can see, one of the things that this internal control area focuses on is really having some kind of a policy, implementing it in a certain manner to safeguard assets, avoid fraud, or achieve an entity's objectives. So I think if you think about all of those components coming together is really what internal control is. But why I'm highlighting this quite importantly is that actually in a very common sense way, everyone believes they understand what internal control means, and everyone understands it differently. I was just on a call before we started this evening, where one of my colleagues was explaining to me what a conversation at the government level on this same matter was. And evidently one of the government officials from the MCA, that person's understanding of internal controls was, you got to tell me that everything is okay. Right? That is their ask of auditors actually. They're asking auditors to tell the government and public at large that everything is okay. Now you can really imagine that such a wide kind of definition could mean anything. And I think that is going to be the practical challenge that we are going to deal with. So for instance, the question that has been asked, and the institute is doing some work around this, is that what is the framework within which we will provide any kind of assurance or reporting on internal controls, right? And actually when this question was posed to the government, evidently the response was, why do you need a framework? All we want you to tell us is everything is okay. So, and I think this is actually the nub of the matter over here, is how do we get to a point where we can communicate something meaningfully on internal controls, whether we are a company or an auditor, but at the same time be able to work within some platform or some framework such that we are not providing an absolute assurance on everything, because frankly I don't think we can. I think that's really what it translates down into. The last definition on this slide is the definition that is actually extracted from what we call the COSO framework, or the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations framework, which focuses on actually defining internal controls in the most widely used framework for reporting on internal controls. Now, let's quickly consider what does clause 49 actually require. In the CEO and CFO certification, what clause 49 requires is that the CEO and CFO need to take responsibility that they have established, maintained internal controls, assessed the effectiveness, and communicated or disclosed any deficiencies and how they propose to remedy them. In simple terms, this is what is the requirement. Now, I've worked with a number of listed companies across the space, and actually, even though this clause 49 is applicable, I am yet to see a structured testing program, for instance, for any CFO or CEO to really say that I reached my conclusion around the effectiveness of controls because I have tested all of these controls and this is the conclusion that I've got to. So one of the challenges that we have, and this is truly the discussion that's happening in a lot of boards of director meetings today, is what is the difference? Wasn't clause 49 also anyway requiring us to have internal controls? Wasn't there a CEO and CFO certification? So really what has changed? So if we think about the clause 49 requirements, I would break them down into these 4 buckets. 1, that establishing controls. 2, testing them. 3, disclosing deficiencies that relate to design or operation of these controls. And 4, any remediation steps involved. I'm happy and would be very delighted if someone could correct me, but you know, I don't know of many audit committees or boards of directors meetings where actually this is being presented in this manner. And I think one of the challenges that we are going to face is that if this was the requirement, then is this change only about complying with the existing requirement, or is this something totally new? And I think that's a practical consideration that we need to consider. But it isn't as if the Companies Act is just this. There is a difference, and I'd like to spend a couple of minutes actually talking about this. The 134 section of the Companies Act of 2013 focuses on adequacy and effectiveness of controls. Okay? And then when it goes into the explanation, it talks about the orderly and efficient conduct of the business. Now, I can tell you that this is an area which could be anything. Take for example, let's take a practical consideration, is that if you had to comment on whether a business is being run efficiently, how would you do it? Every company will probably have some competitor that runs more efficiently than it. So are you going to therefore be required to comment saying that, so and so company is running well in its own way, but actually there are 5 other companies that run more efficiently? Second, on what basis will you make that comment? Like, do you have the intelligence, do you have the information to make that comment, or is that a speculation based on public information that is available to you? Third very important aspect that I'd highlight is that this requirement for communication around internal financial control is not restricted to financial reporting. And this is a fundamental challenge that we have in India compared to any other framework that I'm aware of internationally. Internationally, even in the US markets, which are considered to be the most stringent in this context, Sarbanes-Oxley requirements for communication or reporting on internal controls focus on internal controls over financial reporting and do not go beyond that. Here, internal financial controls could mean any controls that are internal to an organization and deal with financial matters. Take, for example, budgeting exercises. Now, we all know that some companies meet budgets, some companies don't. So, if you don't meet a budget, does that mean that your internal controls are not adequately working or they're not working efficiently? This is a question that is unfortunately, I think, lost in the bad drafting of the section. So they have written the section in such a way that it is all-encompassing. And I think from a professional standpoint, the risk that it exposes auditors to is that this could be interpreted in any way at any point in time. So some of the sections in the Companies Act certainly suffer from very drafting that really allows for very wide interpretations, and this is certainly one of them. Now, multiple representations have been made, so this is not something that has been lost on the government or the MCA, but as of now there has been no change. Everyone expects this to change, but as we've seen other aspects of the Companies Act, many people expected changes but they didn't happen. Take, for example, corporate social responsibility as an area. 9 out of 10 people that you met always believed that those sections and that requirement will disappear when the act is finalized. Once the act was finalized, they believed that the requirements would disappear when the rules are finalized. When the rules were finalized, they expected that something would happen and they would get amended, but it didn't happen. And I think one of the things that all of us need to be very conscious about is that the way this is drafted, until this changes, it really poses a very difficult question for companies and auditors to really make a statement. Let's say you wanted to make a statement and really address this. What would you do to address it? If you had to assess, for instance, whether your purchase order approval policy or your procurement policy, which has internal financial controls, is efficiently run, how would you do it? And I think this is really actually an area which, as of now, the powers that be have chosen to consciously ignore. And I think we're going to have more and more challenges because of that. I want to, as I take you through this discussion, I want you to focus, when we talk about Section 134, really focus on 3 elements. One is on adequacy, 2 is on efficiency, and 3 or effectiveness, and the third is on orderly and efficient conduct. Adequacy, as you know, is a purely judgmental criteria. What is adequate for one person may be inadequate for another. And again, in the absence of having a framework which talks about this, I think we're going to have lots of challenges in being able to define this. Similarly, effectiveness. So for instance, maybe the Japanese player who reached the US Open final may believe that he had a really effective tournament. He was the first Asian to get to a Grand Slam final, right? But actually, maybe someone else may believe he was ineffective because he couldn't win. And I think this is going to be a practical consideration, that everyone's compass is different and everyone's magnifying glass is different, and therefore we could have real differences of opinions. Now think about this. If you are an auditor, now you need to think about this in real life. If you are an auditor and you believe something was ineffective, a company's management tells you, no, we believe it's effective. How do you arbitrate such a dispute? If you have an accounting issue, you have an accounting standard that forms the framework within which you can arbitrate that discussion. If you have a tax issue, you have a tax law or a tax code or a section or a case law that provides you some information. On pure adequacy or effectiveness, who is going to arbitrate? And I worry about this because what this may end up doing is put so much pressure on professionals in the auditing space that they are just forced to agree without fully being conscious of the liability and responsibilities that they're taking on. Equally, this may put so much pressure on companies who are completely unsure about where they should draw the line. If you have higher standards than your competitors, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think will become a very interesting question actually to think about. I think finally, orderly and efficient conduct can mean anything. It's very interesting. If you travel in India, most people will tell you that Indian traffic in Mumbai is the most orderly. Yes? I was in Delhi 2 days ago. I can tell you it is more orderly than Delhi. But if you are in Singapore 2 days hence, is this going to be orderly? We don't know. So the pure relative aspects of being able to determine what is orderly and what is effective or what is efficient is going to be extremely challenging for us to articulate. So what are the challenges that we have in front of us? First, it's clear that section 134 is different from clause 49. This is not the first time, this is not the only area in which SEBI's requirements are being quite distinct from the Companies Act requirements. And I think this is something that's becoming increasingly challenging for companies to make this differentiation. Let's take, for example, a large conglomerate or a group which has listed companies and unlisted companies. For certain aspects, you will apply a different measure because they are listed companies. For other companies, you will apply a different measure. It's quite difficult practically to be able to manage this. Take, for example, also what is the increase in scope of responsibilities for the board of directors, for management, as well as for auditors. This is a substantial increase. And I think, in a practical sense, I don't think this has really hit home. Many companies are just waiting for the March year end before actually having to deal with this, but that change is actually not far. The third area that I would like to highlight is that a lot of this is qualitative in nature. And my observation is that actually we are quite bad culturally at qualitative things. Because we don't like to disagree as a culture. We don't like to disagree. We don't like to publicly state, I have a different opinion from someone else. We prefer consensus culturally. And therefore, I think a very practical consideration is that this whole concept of being persuaded or persuading people is going to take a completely new dimension. And we are going to have lots of challenges in dealing with qualitative aspects for which there is no threshold. Now, to be honest, the answer is not to put a rule. Because the moment we put a rule, we know we find ways to deal or circumvent with the rule. So that is not the answer. But there is a very practical challenge of putting out qualitative criteria. And we've seen many examples. Let me give you one from an accounting sphere. We know AS 13 deals with investments, and AS 13 talks about other than temporary diminution in investments for long-term investments. But if you look at the practice in India of determining other than temporary diminution, it's abysmal. And the reason is that we don't call anything bad until it is completely gone. And this happens across companies, across firms, auditors, professionals, everything, because we always believe something may happen in the future. Now take, for example, internal control, and I'm using this example just to illustrate a point. Let's assume you identify a control gap in a company and you're dealing with this company. Let's assume you're an internal auditor or an external auditor. the first response I can almost guarantee you will get is that has something gone wrong? That's going to be the first response. Your response could very well be, but it could, jab hoga dekha jayega. So I think one of the practical challenges that we are having is we are going to talk about internal controls in a hypothetical situation. What happens if something could go wrong? If it's gone wrong, it's already in the financial statements. That I don't think will require too much expertise. The issue is, how do we identify and report externally situations where something could go wrong? And I think for all of us as professionals, we're going to have big challenges in being able to do this. And I think the last aspect is that there is really a lack of a prescribed framework within which we are going to do this evaluation or do a reporting and certification. Now, some of the things that have been happening around this, I think, is quite important in India. But before I get to that, I'd just like to give you a quick overview of the international perspective on this, and then I'll talk about what is actually happening, the institute and their guidance note and so on and so forth. So if we look at the international experience, primarily Sarbanes-Oxley Act stands up as the main source when you look at internal financial control or internal control reporting. And Sarbanes-Oxley, as you know, was really a reaction to the corporate disasters that happened in the US, post Enron, WorldCom and so on. There was a perception that you can't only report financial data which is historical. So this is the simple thing. They said, look, this company looked perfect. One day, next day it was gone. Now, maybe that was the right financial reporting also, but it did not provide useful information to readers or stakeholders. So the thing that would have been very helpful is if you had highlighted that this company has very poor financial controls, or there are certain weaknesses and gaps, there's no segregation of duties, so on and so forth, and therefore this would have given an inkling to a reader or a stakeholder that something was not altogether correct. So if you look at the track record of Sarbanes-Oxley, Sarbanes-Oxley has resulted in a number of things, and we're not completely sure what is the cause and what is the effect. But has it reduced the number of corporate disasters? The answer is yes. I think that certainly seems to be this thing. Whether it is the reason why corporate disasters have reduced or no, we don't know. But it is certainly a matter of fact that some of the disasters that happened earlier, that kind of momentum got stemmed. Has it been good for consultants? Absolutely. It was a gold mine actually. In the US, most accounting and professional firms made tons of money doing Sarbanes-Oxley work, and most companies still don't have a clue why they spent that money. So they've spent a lot of money doing this. There is a ton of documentation and systems. Many people have found employment through this process, but has that actually resulted in tangible business benefits or control benefits? I think the jury is still out on that one. The use of COSO framework is really what is the most prominently used framework across the world. I'm going to talk a bit about the framework and its components shortly. But I think the question around costs and benefits is actually, in my mind, the biggest question. Is that we can do all of this, but is there a benefit? Any legislation has to be with an intended goal or aim. And what is the intended goal and aim of this, and how do we measure whether it's effective? I think there is a big lacuna in India in articulating how will we measure whether this is a good piece of legislation or not. But I think one of the things that Sarbanes-Oxley and reporting under Sarbanes-Oxley has highlighted, and this has caught the attention of a lot of regulators, is that the reporting of a weakness tends to happen only when something goes wrong. So whether this internal control reporting has resulted in a foreshadowing, like providing some information before something happens, that actually has been a big area of regulatory scrutiny. So what the regulators, for example, the US Securities and Exchange Commission has been doing, saying that when a company reports a material weakness or a significant deficiency, are they reporting it in areas only where something has gone wrong, or did they capture this before it went wrong? And they are questioning companies. The Public Company Accounting Oversight Board is questioning auditors because they want to assess that the true value of some of this reporting is only when it foreshadows, when it provides advance information of something that could go wrong. I think we need to ask ourselves as professionals whether we are ready to put our neck out and say nothing has gone wrong today, but I am still going to qualify or going to report negatively on a report because I believe something could go wrong. That is a big step forward from where we are today, and I think I would leave that point for you to think about. So what is this COSO framework? So framework by itself is actually pretty straightforward. It has 5 components that talk about control environment, the risk assessment function that you do, control activities, how information and communication works in an organization, and how monitoring works. Actually, if you think about it, it's a good framework, it makes sense. The question is only how do you find a sensible way of being able to apply this on companies of different size. I think as was pointed out, currently, and I'll just give you an update on what is likely to happen. Currently, the way this reporting requirement is, it is basically for all companies if from an auditor perspective, and from a listed company perspective for the board also to report on. This is likely to change, and I'll just talk to you about what that is. But ultimately in India, even listed companies are of all kinds, right? We have some 8,000 odd listed companies, but as you know, maybe the top 100 or 200 are only the ones that are meaningful in terms of size or scale or complexity. So one of the practical challenges is you can't do a Rolls-Royce model for a company that cannot afford it. So if a company is struggling to kind of grow its business, it's unlikely they're going to spend that much time and effort focusing on this, even though this is a requirement. And I think that's the simple point that I would like to leave with you. So COSO really had 2 frameworks. There was a 1992 framework, and this has now been updated to a 2013 framework. The basic underlying principles, the underlying components are the same 5 components, but there are now a further elucidation of principles that talk about it. So what the 2013 framework does, and the reason I'm highlighting it is this is the framework that the institute is working to provide as a guidance note to its members for the purpose of working on this. So this framework that it talks about is really says that an effective system of internal control, that all the 5 components should be present and functioning, and this is something I'm going to highlight as a challenge, and that they all work in an integrated manner, which is also potentially a challenge, and that a major deficiency exists if you cannot conclude that these conditions are met. The reason why I'm saying that this is difficult is that the framework requires you to consider, I would say, a more mature organizational model. It talks about a situation where there are overarching controls, a control framework, communication, monitoring, and so on. Many Indian enterprises do not operate this way. Take for example, even how Indian audits get done. Many small company audits or even medium-sized company audits get done on a purely substantive basis. So what you do is, you have a team of auditors who descend on a company, say, give me all the vouchers, and then they tick and bash every voucher that exists, and then they get comfort over the financial statements and the trial balance. This is not uncommon. This happens all the time. What you don't do is spend time on looking at the control environment, looking at organizational level controls or higher level controls. A lot of the focus in auditing in India tends to be on transactional or substantive based testing, which are also undeniably appropriate auditing techniques, but they don't fit into this framework. So just imagine that you are dealing with a small company owned by, let's say, a family, just as an example. And you go to the promoter or the owner or the person who's running it and say, look, I'm your internal auditor. I want to know how I should document our organization-wide controls. He says, you're looking at it. I'm the control. So how do we actually make that step forward where we can translate the way in which Indian companies run and operate and move it into a slightly different environment? This is going to be a challenge. The second area that I would like to highlight as a practical challenge is our dislike for documentation. Okay. One of the practical elements of being able to reach any conclusion on internal controls or anything is that there must be some documentation of the control activities. And even in relatively sophisticated companies, I have noticed this to be a really significant component. So take for example a CFO or a financial controller of a reasonably medium-sized company is doing a trial balance scrutiny, okay, or review of some information. More often than not, there will neither be a maker nor a checker. There will be neither a documentation of the control activities nor any documentation of any tolerance or exceptions or what was done with the exceptions. The person may very well have done a control function. Please appreciate the difference that I am drawing. That person may be competent to do that also, but there is no trail. All he can tell you is, I reviewed that. Now, if you are an auditor, both internal or external, and you had to actually assess whether this has been reviewed, how will you achieve that? When there is no framework, when there is no documentation, there is no trail, it is very difficult to do this. Up till now, our focus on financial statements and financial statement preparation or audit has been, is there an error? Right? There may be no error. But if that review process has not been documented appropriately or not been trailed appropriately, or if an exception has been raised, how it has been dealt with is not appropriately documented, you cannot conclude that the control environment is functioning. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge in Indian mindset for us to actually make. Is not that the activity is not happening. Please don't mistake what I'm saying. The control may be there. In many promoter-run companies, they know every rupee that goes in and out of the company. That level of control exists, but there is no evidence. And in the absence of evidence, just imagine the professional risk or responsibility you will be taking to say, without evidence, I'm concluding things work. It's going to be really a very big leap of faith for us to actually go down that route. And I think if you look at the COSO framework, and I won't spend too much time on this, but within each of these 5 components, you have 17 principles that actually are broken down, that provide a little more flavor to each of these components. Now, I am not seeking to scaremonger or create more buzz than what is required. But effectively what you're supposed to do is that for every control within the organization, map it to where this fits in this table. Just imagine the amount of time and effort it would take to create even a reasonable documentation trail around this. When US companies moved to Sarbanes-Oxley, which by the way did not have 17 principles at that stage, you know, roughly audit time roughly doubled in the first year. Now, whether auditors, companies, anyone, government has actually thought about this, I think is a moot point. And whether we can do this for 31st March 15 is also a moot point. Whether we can do it for how many companies is also a moot point. So there are a number of aspects that I think that goes to. Let me also kind of just highlight for a moment is that all of this ultimately does make sense. Okay, so don't for a moment walk away from this room with the perception that none of this is logical or this thing. But I think we are going to struggle to be able to take this model and fit it into most of our Indian corporate environment that we have, because many Indian companies don't operate to this level of structure or formality. It's just a much more amorphous, loose approach that actually takes place today. So what's happening in India? So the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India is putting together a guidance note which will provide flavor and guidance to its members on how you should approach this audit of internal financial controls. Now, interestingly, this guidance note, which is not yet released, so whatever I say today, please take with a appropriate pinch of salt, even though I'm speaking with some knowledge about what is happening, is that this guidance note is unlikely to address anything that goes beyond financial reporting. So if you recall, we started off by saying that internal financial controls covers much wider array of controls that go beyond just financial reporting controls, right? The guidance note that is being written talks about financial reporting. So hopefully the government or parliament will make a change in the act, because otherwise we'll be left with a guidance note that provides information in the area that we best understand and no guidance on the area that we least understand, which is what do you do about financial controls that don't correspond directly with financial reporting. This is a big point actually to think about. The second aspect that is still open, I suppose, is that what framework will be used. And there is, in my mind, complete confusion on this. On one hand, as you know, there is a statement of auditing 315 that talks about consideration of internal control in an audit, right? That's always been there. My understanding is the guidance note is going to make reference to this statement of auditing, but provide you guidance which is similar to the COSO framework. So good luck. I think this is going to be again quite difficult for us to be able to differentiate. The other area is that, as you know, in India almost every year there is a deadline and there is a scramble to try and push the deadline. This happens, right? The tax audit report, filing dates, XBRL, IFRS, happens for everything in India. So as this is happening, now people are saying, making very persuasive arguments to say, look, actually, this is a great idea, but not this year, can we do it next year? So there is a possibility that some of this may actually move forward into next year. There's a real possibility around this. The second thing is, people are saying, look, why are you making every company do this? And why are you making a differentiation of where the board will take responsibility and where only auditors will? So why don't we kind of integrate this and only require this for listed companies? So that's another area of discussion that is going on. And listed, by the way, means equity or debt. Okay, so not just listed equity. And of course, I think on framework there continues to be some amount of confusion around this. And the reason I say this is the framework is important because it can differentiate or determine many things. The board of directors of audit committee quite often would then entrust that responsibility to someone independent from that first line of defense. So not the doer. In most organizations that lands up to be internal audit. In that context, I'm saying either the organization, which you could broadly say the management, operating management or internal audit, or the external auditor, one has to report. If the organization reports, the external auditor will report, there is no tension, everyone is fine. The problem is that what happens if the organization doesn't report? And how does the auditor deal with this? Let me give you another example. After some of our own very famous corporate disasters we've had in India, we should have seen how in the backlash of that, how auditors of all kinds increased the work that they did on bank confirmations, for example. Right? External auditors across India suddenly became very interested in bank confirmations. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, do you know an organization that maybe doesn't have a foolproof way of getting confirmations? Many organizations do. Will you highlight that as a weakness externally? That is the point. So actually the test will be not whether the weakness exists or to identify it. I think professionally we are all capable of doing that. Question is, will we be able to tell the cat and report it externally? I think any such discussion would be incomplete if we did not talk about whether there is any business benefit for all of this one. Is that why are we doing this? Are we trying to create employment for chartered accountants? Are we trying to create one more legislation that we can be proud of? What is the reason for this? The reason in my mind is quite simply they're saying we want to foreshadow something going on. So they're saying, look, some of the disasters in India would not have happened if someone had identified these control weaknesses and reported them earlier. That's a noble intention. But how are we going to do this? And I think in India, the unique thing is people will do it differently. We have some larger companies and corporates who are really investing a lot of time, effort and money in documenting, streamlining, creating armies of people who will do testing. The new term, testing of internal controls. A lot of people will do all of this. There are other entities that are actually, it's amazing. It's almost like they're not operating in the same environment. They're just not bothered. We are saying, oh, we've been audited for many years. We'll deal with it. And I think that is going to be, in my mind actually, the biggest challenge of proving the benefits of this. Is that if this is not applied consistently, in my mind it has very limited benefit, even at a corporate sector level, as opposed to at an individual company level. Now, are there companies that have actually benefited from this? I would say, from my experience, many companies do not benefit from this. I think an honest opinion. I think many companies treat this as one more compliance task, one more thing that needs to be done, one more form that needs to be filled. But there are at least a handful of companies that I've personally seen who have benefited from this. But those are the companies that embrace this fully. That say, okay, what is the underlying philosophy of this? And every time that something goes wrong in the business, they do a root cause analysis saying what control did not capture this, what process was inappropriate, and why did we not capture this and someone else did, or why did this go wrong? I think companies that are more thoughtful, entities that want to address this can get some value, but it's an all or nothing thing in my mind. If you want to do this because you have to do it, you will unlikely get any value. It will just be a cost. But if you want to do it and really embrace and find some value in it, chances are you will get something out of it. I want to leave you with 3 situations for you to think about before I open up for questions around this. So it could be any stakeholder, it could be a director, it could be an auditor, it could be a management, it could be anything. Let's assume you come across a situation where you know you are non-compliant with some act, some rule. In India we've got so many acts and so many rules. Almost everyone is non-compliant or something. What would you do? And think about this in a sliding scale. Maybe very small, it may be very large. Some companies today proactively monitor areas of non-compliance. They say we are non-compliant in these areas and this is our plan to become compliant. But the fact that the non-compliance exists is a reality. Now what happens if I take this one step further and say that you found some minor illegal act? What's the illegal act? Could be paying a small bribe. Why is that illegal? There is a Prevention of Bribery Act. Right? Which company has not done some? So when you come across, and I'm saying minor because the major becomes easier to actually conclude on this, what would you do? And finally, what would you do if you read a negative report? What is your reaction? Would you sell the stock? Would you stop giving money to the company? What should you do? This is deeply important actually. Because as much as this is an instrument which is intended for good, it will be meaningful only if it is understood well. If we, ban kitchen knives because people get killed with a kitchen knife, then we are missing the picture. And I think the question that we have over here is, there will be a report on internal controls which we've never seen before. Someone will say this company has got weaknesses. What will that mean? If you are a director of the company, would you resign? If you are a lender, would you curtail what you are lending? If you are doing business with such a company, what would your reaction be? If you are a shareholder, what would your reaction be? And I want you to think about this because these are the practical considerations, well beyond the reporting considerations that we need to deal with. Anyway, it is true, as I end my conversation, it is true that very few people want to become auditors these days. Right? On a lighter note, the related area around fraud reporting is also very fascinating because if you commit a fraud as a normal individual, chances are someone will sue you for the money you stole or whatever. So pay back whatever you took. But God say you're an auditor of a company where fraud is committed, you are potentially going to get 3 times back. So there is very little joy in the world of auditing. And these are the dilemmas that I think we will need to wrestle with. So on that note, I would kind of end my conversation here. Be happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
I think one of the important points that you made is there are knee-jerk reactions by the legislators and the bureaucrats. In fact, one of my friends, Jayant Kapoor, says that Companies Act 2013 should be named as Raju and Roy Act. That's how. In fact, what also happens is probably there are instruments available in the hands of the executive which they fail to exercise, and then every time the reaction is to shift the onus, shift the burden, and increase the compliance requirements for the citizen and the business. With that, we have the floor open for questions. I think there are a lot of questions. Venkat has also thrown a lot many questions at us, which we need to ponder upon. So let's have this session where there are more questions. I'm sure Venkat will be happy to answer.
Even the alternative when the fraud is occurred and the management resists it, it's better to resign or report it to the other authorities.
So, sir, I've not addressed this fraud reporting area, but that's another prominent area within the Act and responsibilities that it casts upon. There's a guidance law that is being drafted on that also. I think the truth be told, what you said is correct, which is that in a situation where there is significant fraud and you find a difficult management to deal with, maybe the right answer is to resign. But how practically this would actually transpire is, I think, the moot point actually. Because these are situations where we could be simplistic and just say, yes, we should resign. But actually, in practice, what tends to happen is either you tend to rationalize it in some manner. Sometimes clients are significant or influential enough that make you think differently than if you were not significant or influential. And therefore, I'm a little hesitant to just say, look, you should resign, because yes, that's the right answer. Does that actually happen all the time? I don't know.
But in the experiences of the English Act which you go through, that resignation causes more damage to the company and to the society in general, and therefore it's anti-ethical.
So,
if you report it, it becomes more damaging to the auditor and also to the company. Which way you choose it?
These are very tricky areas.
But these are practical things which are going to arise by.
I agree, and which is why I'm hesitant to generalize and say there's only one answer in a practical sense. There are all kinds of factors you need to weigh before you kind of make your position clear. My observation, slightly tangential to your question, is also it would help if everyone had similar standards.
Everyone has.
Similar standards on these matters. The fact that, many, let's assume for a moment, you had a situation where the company is not very ethical, but the company knows that if you resign, they can go to 5 other firms who will happily take them as a client. That causes a challenge. It's a problem with the way in which the structure is. So, as I said, I think the right answer is here, but whether this actually takes place in the way we are not in an ideal world.
Not in. But sometimes for external force, area.
Sometimes for external firms which are auditors, areas under internal audit are defined by the management, which sometimes are not adequate according to the internal auditor, because it does not cover all high risk areas. But because of various considerations, I mean we cannot go beyond that. So what should be the situation? Shall we communicate to audit committee that these are all areas are not covered like that, or what should be the course of action?
The way I would respond to that is there are 2 elements. One is the responsibility of the board of directors itself to design, devise and identify appropriate scope of work for internal audit, right, or monitor that performance. That is the, I would say, the first element that you need to consider. As an external auditor, while you could always provide your inputs, I don't think you need to go that far as to try and define the scope of internal audit. What you do need to comment on in this context is the fact that internal audit is not covering certain areas. If it impacts your assessment of internal control, then that is something that is worthy of being highlighted. But I think we must sometimes resist the temptation of going beyond what our requirements are. Honestly, we have enough now to deal with. So I don't think we need to overreach at all and try and do more.
The external auditor has a right to comment on internal auditor's non-form.
Absolutely.
So we say it is not adequate. Internal controls are adequate. Internal auditor has not been done.
All I'm saying,
I have done it many times. So I'm telling you.
it's a moot point as to whether under new act, whether, for example, cargo as we know it, for instance, will continue following the circular. So I think there are some elements around what is our specific responsibility. I think most good companies would welcome an input from the external auditors as long as it is based on some sensible opinion or evidence as opposed to just a kind of point of view. Yes.
In the requirements I read that internal control system is in place. So what's the significance of system over here?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I mean, it's a body, it is integrated, all of that, but it doesn't mean IT system.
It doesn't mean IT system, right? Okay.
Often it happens that deficiencies identified in 1 year are reappearing in the next year as well. And the management is of the opinion that since we have already reported that in the previous year, there is no requirement to report that again. How do we address this?
Shall I be slightly playful and ask you a question? And do you do an audit every year or no?
Yes, we do.
You have to report.
But then what actually happens in those cases is that management is of the opinion that since internal audit report is sent out to a lot of stakeholders, so it will cast a very negative impression. So under those opinions, they often try to persuade us not to.
So this is where you have to persuade them. It's character building conversation.
Thank you.
In the beginning, there was an inconsistency which was pointed out between section 134 and 143. I think that question has not been answered, whether a private company would be required to report IFC internal financial control or no, or whether it would be applicable only to district company.
So there's a lot of discussion that is going on right now on this topic. Okay. There's an expectation, I would highlight and underline,
an expectation that this may be limited only to listed companies potentially. There's nothing formal out of this, but that's an expectation that many people have, at least from discussion. I would say just watch this space, it will happen pretty soon.
Can I just add to that?
Sir?
Just before you, having said that, to answer your question on whether it will be applicable to private limited companies, the applicability of not IFC but internal controls relating to financial reporting is made mandatory for all companies through the rules. So as the position stands today, it is applicable to every company, including private limited companies. But the differentiation is with listed companies versus public companies which are unlisted and private limited companies on one side. So the grouping is listed companies and public limited companies or any other company, whether private or otherwise. So these are the two groups. For the listed company it is internal financial controls, and for others it is ICOFAR, as we call, internal controls related to financial reporting. So that's the position as it stands right now.
Sir, my question is, sometimes these companies, they move up the ladder as far as the culture is concerned. When they are relatively smaller, they resort to some other things which in your last slide you said minor illegal things, whether they are material or not. So my question is on that. As they move up the ladder, the working culture improves. And they themselves know that yesterday what I did last year, this year I improved. As an auditor, doing the historic accounts as my case for the audit. Although I know now this year they have grown wiser, but as far as my report for the last year is concerned, how do I address it, sir? And if you can support it with your personal experiences on this. Thank you.
So, I'll tell you one of the worrying aspects that I see within this act and requirement is that there is a real risk that auditors will make someone else's problem their problem. Okay? And the reason I say this is, let's assume a company, as you said, was skirted areas of ethics or compliance. Who did that? The company. Up till now, basically we still have to report on financial statements, true and fair, materiality, a lot of things. Now we're going to report on some of this. The risk is, as a community, we will get convinced to say, things are getting better, we won't make this mistake again. But who is taking that risk now? The person who signed it. And I think actually, as a professional, I feel this is the time when we'll all be tested on how strong we can be to avoid this. I'll tell you, when I said, I used the word carefully, when I said, who will bell the cat? I want to see which company is going to come out with the first negative report on this. Which auditor is going to sign this? Whether once you signed it, they are all very important factors. We know now the Companies Act will be appointed for 5 years. What is going to happen in that context?
6th year, I don't mind signing.
So, sir, these are the factors, right? What you're touching on is a very real issue, but this is the factor. And I fear, without wanting to generalize, that there may be many situations where people will get persuaded to take on risks that they are not compensated for or they did not sign up for. So it's important that we are all strong actually. It's really important for us to get this right. And by the way, a negative internal control report is not the end of the world. even though it's quite obvious that every company will make you believe that that is the end of the world, it's not the end of the world. So we've got to be that much more conscious and careful. I hope that it is shared now for all. Yes.
If you just throw some light on current requirement in Karo relating to internal control, how it is different?
I was very hoping that you would not ask this question. It's difficult to say actually, other than this is very explicit, this will probably come with a framework and a guidance note and so on, focus only on this element. As I said, SA 315 also existed, right? But whether we all tested it, focused on it or no, I think is a moot point. So for us the change is going to be a amalgamation of two elements. One, of doing what we probably should have been doing earlier anyway, and two, dealing with some of the new elements that are coming. So the question you asked is a good question. I've certainly come across a couple of clients when they're negotiating fees who ask exactly the same question, saying that, what you're always doing this, so nothing has changed. Because things have changed. So.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Whether this will be applicable to interim financial reporting, means where we are doing audit for copy-related financial circle or any bit of the financial.
So this is a vexing subject actually. The Institute came out with guidance on fraud-related reporting for year-end or interim periods and so on. I'm going to try and answer this question to the best of my abilities, but some of this I think is not yet formalized. What is likely to become my understanding, what is likely to become relevant, is that any engagement that you do as an auditor, by virtue of you being the statutory auditor of a company, is going to be covered under all of these requirements. Okay, so let's say for instance you did some special audit. Some banks are appointing people to do special audits. That would not be covered. But let's say you did an interim audit by virtue of being the statutory auditor of a company and you issued a report. In all likelihood, my understanding is that this will be clarified and it will be applicable. You may be aware that the announcement the Institute put out on fraud and internal control reporting was, I suppose, more about just giving people a little more time. My understanding is that before the end of this month, this will get clarified. So please watch this space. If you're doing an interim reporting for September, it will become very relevant.
The director's responsibility statement with respect to listed company, is it restricted to only the standalone financial statements or consolidated financial statements? And if it is consolidated, whether like if I have say domestic subsidiaries and international subsidiaries, whether those would be covered?
So the statement actually now covers reporting for the company, so effectively covers consolidated statements. What you raised is a very good question in a different context, which is that let's assume the parent company is audited by one firm and other components are audited by another firm. Does the parent company auditor take responsibility? My understanding is this will be clarified as to not being the case. But there are many potential fact patterns on this. Okay, the fact pattern of, for example, fraud reporting also will come. My suggestion is just wait. My guess is in another 2 weeks you will get some specific guidance on this.
And I have another question. I know it's still an open point. The auditor's responsibility is under section 143. Is it restricted to IFC or ICFR? How are they going to, place their reliance on, like if say a company has an internal financial controls being designed parallel to the SOX which is there in the US, how are they going to take comfort from the management of the company that there is an internal control system which has been placed?
So two things. One is, as it stands today, the Act section talks about internal financial controls. Okay. So if it gets modified, it gets modified, but that's where it stands today. As regards how, as an auditor, you would undertake your Act Test responsibility, you will have to do whatever procedures you need to do to get comfort. They can follow whatever framework. You'll be guided by the guidance from the institute where it comes.
One last question.
Whether this internal control should cover operational risk also from the point of view of company.
Can you just explain the question?
Yeah, my question is that if company is implementing the internal controls over financial reporting, basically, as you see, this is basically implementation of POSO. In POSO, there was a risk identification, or actually the kind of risk identification, in which we have to consider financial risk or operational risk both.
Operational risk has a financial reporting.
There will be some cases which have no financial effect, but maybe compliance issues only.
Which has a financial impact.
Okay, only financial impact.
If it affects financial reporting,
then
if you are doing ICOP or internal controls of financial reporting, the focus is on financial reporting.
Then what is the basic difference between COS 14 and CA/CFO certification in ICE basically?
So between clause 49 and internal financial controls, the big area of difference is got to do with maybe the fly is telling me time is up. The big area has got to do with actually when you go beyond financial reporting to financial controls that are not related to financial reporting. That's one. And two is when you talk about orderly and efficient conduct, which could mean anything in a business. But this area of orderly and efficient conduct, there is no guidance also being proposed. Okay, this is my understanding. So it's like I don't know what it means actually. Maybe you should find a new professional. It's very confusing.
Thank you, Venkat. I think all of us need to go back to two books which we usually refer to. One is Code of Ethics, which usually we read when we qualify and we get that book from the institute. I don't know how many of us go back and read that again. The second is Bhagavad Gita. I think, as you rightly said, we need to have and continue to ensure that our character remains very strong. We are able to resist all sorts of temptations and pressures. I think with that, I request Himanshu Vasa to propose a very well-deserved vote of thanks.
Friends, I think we started at 6:15 and we are almost at 7:45, which is an hour and 25 minutes if my math is right. If an hour and 25 minutes of talk can generate so much of heat, can generate so much of discussion at a lecture meeting, you can imagine what will happen if not all, a few of us sit together to try and break our heads on what the requirements are, what the issues facing us are, whether it is ICOFAR or IFC, whether it is applicable to consolidation or to standalone financials, whether CARO is applicable or will we see another order coming in place of CARO, whether it is requirements of clause 49 or requirements of Companies Act, the differentiation or the subtle differences between the two, or whether auditors need to report on internal financial controls or ICOFAR as defined under the Companies Act, when the company itself, and that too in case of public companies where the capital is less than 25 crores, where the director's responsibility statement gives exemption from reporting on either ICOFAR or IFC, whichever is applicable. I'm sorry, it can't be IFC, it has to be ICOFAR. Whether auditors are required to comment on that or qualify saying that directors have not commented, so we cannot comment. These are a number of issues that all of us are facing. And this is a fantastic opportunity, if I look at it, both from a statutory auditors, professionals or internal audit professionals, to learn on what the process needs to be followed, including whether COSO 92 or COSO 13. And what the society has done is has organized a 2-day intensive workshop for every member of the professional body, cutting across all stakeholders, be it statutory auditor, internal auditor, or representatives of industry who would like to learn this area of ICOFAR. I'm restricting it to ICOFAR. Please do come and register yourselves for a 2-day intensive workshop that we are holding in Bombay, which is first of its kind to my mind across the country. On 17th and 18th of October, we are doing a 2-day intensive workshop where we will take you through all aspects of ICOFAR, including identification, preparing of risk registers, testing, and all of it. And I would also urge each one of you to pick up the publication of Gita, which is published by the BCA, referred to by my dear friend and colleague and the president of the society currently. If not the entire Bhagavad Gita, please read the Gita book, which is written by one of our dear friend Chetan Dalal, who is also a very, very important important stakeholder within the professional. If you can't or if you don't want to read the whole of Bhagavad Gita, taking forward the requirements of the Companies Act, one of the other important aspects is related party transactions. And a very learned speaker in the form of Gautam Doshi, an eminent chartered accountant, is going to speak at this very venue on 8th of October. Besides that, a number of other programs. We've spoken about, actually, we have a half-day securities law workshop again on 17th of October. For those of you who want to improve your writing skills or writing skills of your colleagues or your juniors or by whatever name you may call, we have a program on professional writing skills on 11th of October. And for those of us who are a little bit more savvy and want to do things other than professional, we have 2 very interesting programs, a hike over this weekend, and we have a very, very innovative 2-day togetherness, networking, carnival known Jankar. So please enroll for any of these programs that you may like. Having said that, it is only appropriate that we recognize the person who has shared so much of not information but knowledge with all of us sitting here and has set us thinking to decide what we want to do, how we need to tackle situations, in some form telling us these are the areas of concern with which you as professionals need to look at, and giving us a heads up to say, friends, hey friends, these are the things that you need to talk to your clients, These are the things that you need to decide and take a stand on, and also tell us what is happening globally, what is happening in Delhi and a few other places. And this, while he has said that it is to the best of his knowledge and information, which I agree, but I must also tell you that probably he's sitting on most of those committees in Delhi or at other locations, presenting the auditor's perspective to say these are the issues that are going to hit not only the professional colleagues practicing but also in industry and industry at large. A thought leader in his own self, and yes, I agree with Venkat when he says that he has been associated with BCA in the past, but probably that this is his first lecture meeting, so that was the reference to Nitin's comment. And we also thought that we must follow the directions given by the leader of this country, Narendra Modi. Promote the young. Probably the youngest, one of the youngest speakers on this platform at a lecture meeting. If we have to sum it up all, a fantastic evening well spent with lot of thought-provoking ideas, lot of food for thought, with red flags, cautioning us what to do. What more can you do in a evening action pack of 90 minutes? I think a wonderful evening spent. We can only thank him by just giving him an extremely loud applause. Please join me. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thanks to Himanshu for arranging this lecture meeting.
For instance, let's say you conclude while doing an audit that there are some weaknesses or material weaknesses, as the term is going to be in the guidance note, in internal financial controls. But you conclude that the financial statements are true and fair. This can happen, okay? So there is a gap in the controls, but nothing has gone wrong as of now. Now, if you are a reader of financial statements, how will you absorb this? Please understand that this is going to come in the same auditor's report effectively. On one hand, you will say statements are true and fair, and you will say, yet we noted material weaknesses in your internal controls. So how people are going to be able to absorb information, internalize information and deal with it is also going to be extremely important. Now, globally, for instance, in the US, if you had material weakness in your report, effectively, you will stop auditing after that period. You will stop, okay, until it's corrected. In India, what is being perceived or conceived right now is a situation where material weakness can coexist with a clean audit report for time to come. And I'm not sure whether this will necessarily send out good messages to capital markets, stakeholders. Let's assume you are a bank and you are lending money to a company where the audit report said everything is okay today, but by the way, there is a real gap over here. How are you going to be able to deal with this? And these are the practical day-to-day considerations that we will need to deal with as we move forward. So, let me move to the last part of what I want to talk about. And I'm going to spend some time talking about perspectives and practical considerations. In India, you can never say never for anything, okay? That is my learning. So one of the things to think about is, after all of this, someone may come up and say that SA 315 still requires us to consider internal control. All we want you to do is to do what you were doing all along. Nothing different. Is that possible? Maybe unlikely given some of the efforts that have taken place, but there are certainly some important stakeholders who are making this argument today. So I would say watch this space, important. Are we going to land up with internal controls over financial reporting, or are we going to talk about internal financial controls? To some people, this doesn't seem to be a discussion only. And that is what I find most dangerous, is that some of the people who are responsible for the regulation or writing the rules are effectively saying, why should that make a difference? And actually, if you were a company or you were an auditor, it does make a whole lot of difference. So I think that is one of the challenges to be able to deal with. For example, the point I made around orderly and effective conduct or efficient conduct of a business. We are also going to have to deal with this unique situation of when do we have to report this? On an interim basis, on an ongoing basis, at the year end? Let's assume a company had controls that did not work at all during the year, but at the year end everything is okay. Is that okay? Now, interestingly, internationally, under Sarbanes-Oxley, for instance, the internal control reporting is as at the year end. Okay? So even if you've had a weakness, but it has been remediated during the year and it has been tested to be remediated, it is okay at the year end. You don't qualify that report. India is not clear at this stage what that would mean. But it certainly does spark the question that if a company gets, for instance, a quarterly audit done or a quarterly review done, then is there a responsibility to consider that on a quarterly basis, on an ongoing basis, or what basis over there? What is a reportable matter is going to be, in my mind, one of the top 2 or 3 issues. And I tell you this in link to what one of my clients I've quoted, saying, is it out of your syllabus? Is the question I got. So, I made some wonderful, I thought, useful suggestions and observations on controls and lack thereof in some parts of a business. The client said, actually, this is all very good observation, but aren't you supposed to just sign the financial statements? Why are you telling me about all of this? And I think we are going to deal with this for 2 situations. One is, we may believe it is out of our syllabus. We may say, boss, as long as my financial statements are correct, as long as the trial balance ties up and the balance sheet and P&L is okay and disclosure are appropriate, that's all I'm worried about. But that is not the onus that the Act is placing on us. That's the key point. And therefore, we will need to perforce widen our horizons to think about situations of what could go wrong. This is not how we approach audits generally today. We don't think in a futuristic basis of saying, oh, you know, this is the situation, so something could happen in the future, so should I report it? And many audit committees and boards of directors are not used to having this conversation. Anyway, many of these meetings are compressed, right? There's hardly any time. And then you go and say, look, I'd like to tell you about what could happen. It's like on the side. So I think we need to think about how we're going to deal with these practical issues and for our own thinking to evolve to be able to make those points, which I think is also equally important. It's not just that someone is willing to listen to us, but can we actually make those points? Directors' reactions, I think, and responsibilities are also unique under this Act. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is I think this is a very interesting interplay of different things. As you know, the Act, 2013 Act, puts lots of additional responsibilities on directors, including the requirement to consider internal control and report on it and so on. Now, when that responsibility is on independent directors, audit committee, right, so mainly independent directors, quite often what you will find is that they don't want to actually do it. I know that they've signed up for it, but they don't want to do it. Now, if you don't want to do it, you don't want to hear bad news, okay? You want to hear only everything is okay. And if that is the approach that some boards of directors or audit committee members will take, I think we are going to have fundamental issues, because the way regulators in India will work is just as they have worked internationally, is they will wait for something to go wrong and then question why you did not identify it earlier. Right? And then you will have no defense because the control environment has not changed. Whatever weakness or deficiency existed previously would continue to happen today. Let me also touch upon an important aspect. In the last slide also I will talk about this. Is that one of the elements, and I just want to go back for a moment, okay? Is actually to consider whether an entity runs, see point number 1, demonstrates commitment to integrity and ethical values. Okay? This is the starting point of the control environment. Now, how many companies in India in a practical sense will be able to demonstrate this? I'm not making a cheap comment over here, I'm genuinely asking this question, is that how can you demonstrate this? If you take most of the corporate news that you read these days in the newspaper, it's very difficult to say how will you demonstrate this, how will you audit this, and let's assume how will you do this. So I think this is going to be, I think, another area. The other interesting dynamic as I see it, and certainly from my international experience I can share, is that who will bell the cat is also going to be a very interesting interplay. Let's say there is a problem. Who will report it? Will management report it first? First line of defense? Not sure. Will internal audit report it? And there is, I mean, globally also, increasing pressure on internal audit to be able to demonstrate what they have identified. You know, this is a very different kind of pressure that is coming through, saying, show me what you have identified, which actually slipped through, and what is therefore the value that you are bringing to the organization. The third is, will the external auditor identify it or report it? And who will do this? If management identifies, it's the best situation, honestly, it's the best situation. Any of the other two situations is problematic. Because please bear in mind, ultimately, internal audit is still part of the organization, external audit is appointed by the organization. So for anyone then to decide to report something that has not been identified by the first two, will effectively be some kind of condemnation or comment on the efficiency or effectiveness of the first two. And this is not a discussion that is happening in the company's premises, in the boardroom. This is what will be communicated externally. So the level of sensitivity that will exist, I think on this is going to be many, many times greater than what we have today. So so take for example, today internal audit reports of a company quite often have very good findings, very valuable findings, but these are never circulated externally. Never. Most external audit reports look exactly the same. They use the same words. There's a common template. Now we are moving to a situation where this reporting is going to move externally, is going to put a very different complexion to the challenge. Yes, sir. So the way typically, sir, this works in practice is that obviously the operating management establishes certain procedures, policies and controls that form the first line of defense, so to speak, in an organization. Now when an organization needs to provide an input or provide a reporting on the efficiency and adequacy of these controls,